The role of institutions in economic development. Douglas North describes institutions very broadly as the formal and informal rules or norms governing human behavior. Institutions is defined as formal and informal rules or norms governing human behavior. For example, marriage is an institution. Is a formal or it's an informal rules. At a formal level, institutions can be defined in terms of the extent of property rights protection, the degree to which laws and regulations are fairly enforced, the ability of the government to protect the individual against economic shocks and to provide social protection, and the extent of political correction. At a formal level, institutions can be defined in terms of extent of property rights protection, the degree to which laws and regulations are fairly enforced, the ability of the government to protect the individual against economic shocks and to provide social protection, and the extent of political corruption. Institutional structures and rules of behavior are necessary conditions for economic activity to flourish because incentives and price signals in the market economy cannot function properly without them. Price signals in the market economy cannot function without institutional structures and rules. There are five types of market supporting institutions are necessary condition for economic progress. These five type of market supporting institutions are needed for economic growth. And first one is property rights and legally binding contracts. Property rights and legally binding contracts. These are called market creating institutions. And second one is regulatory institutions, that are market regulating institutions. And the third one is institutions for macroeconomic stability, that is market stabilizing institutions. And fourth one is market insurance institutions, that is market legitimizing institutions. And last one is institutions of conflict management, that is also market legitimizing institution. According to Roderick, poor countries are often characterized by lack of trust, the rule of law, weak institutions to mitigate risks and to manage social conflicts, no clearly defined system of property rights, and inadequacy of regulatory apparatus to control fraud and anti-competitive behavior, and lack of clean government. Okay, according to Roderick, poor countries are often characterized by the lack of many of institutions such as lack of trust, rule of law, weak institutions to mitigate risk and to manage social conflict, no clearly defined system of property rights, and inadequate regulatory apparatus to control fraud and anti-competitive behavior, and lack of clean government. These are the features in poor countries. And we are going to look what are the five prerequisites. And first one is property rights and legally binding contracts. Property rights and legally binding contracts. It means market creating institutions. These are important because agents lack the incentive to invest and innovate if they do not have a control over the return on the asset they accumulate. Okay, these market creating institutions are important because agents lack the incentive to invest and innovate if they do not have the control over the return on their assets. So, intellectual property rights are particularly important to encourage invention. Intellectual property rights are particularly such kind of institutions are kind of market creating institutions are important to encourage invention, and control is more important than ownership. Control is for the functioning of for the proper functioning of market. The control is more important than ownership. So uh, this kind of market creating institutions such as property rights, legally binding contracts are required for economic development. And second is regulatory institutions, market regulating institutions. Market fails if there is fraud or anti-competitive behavior. Regulatory institutions are needed if markets are to be function properly. Regulatory institutions are required for the functioning of the market. When markets are liberalized, a regulatory framework is also required to avoid the consequences of risky behavior, such as financial crisis if the banking system is not properly regulated. So, for such kind of risk, a regulatory institutions is needed. For example, financial crisis of the 2008, mainly because of the lack of regulations. So, regulatory institutions are required for functioning of the market properly. And third is institutions for macroeconomic stability, that is market stabilizing institutions. Monetary and fiscal policy institutions are necessary to provide an enabling environment in which private investment can flourish. So, monetary and fiscal policy institutions, central government and central bank and government are necessary to provide an enabling environment in which private investment can flourish. Financial markets are inherently unstable, which can have damaging real effects, and they need careful supervision. Central bank, a responsible banking system, and fiscal prudence are also important ingredients of macroeconomic stability. It means a proper central bank and a government is important for the macro such kind of institutions. Central bank is one kind of institution and government also one kind of institutions. That kind of institutions are necessary for the macroeconomic stability. These are the market stabilizing institutions. And fourth one is social insurance institutions. That is market legitimizing institutions. These are necessary if individuals are to accept change. Insurance against unemployment, crop failures, and price fluctuations for agriculture commodities are also important if traditional agriculture is to be transformed. Insurance against unemployment, crop failures, and price fluctuations for agriculture commodities are important. Such kind of social insurance institutions are required. In a liberalized era, social security institutions are required to protect the vulnerable sections. In a liberalized era, social security institutions also required to protect the vulnerable section. And fifth one is institutions of conflict management. These are also market legitimizing institutions. Many developing countries have deep ethnic, tribal, and religious divisions. The conflicts of them damages economies because it diverts the resources from directly productive activities and create uncertainty which deters the investment. In many of the countries, there are deep ethnic, tribal, and religious divisions. The conflict of these divisions damages the economies because it diverts the resources from directly productive activities and create uncertainty in that environment. To minimize the conflict requires a full range of institutions. To minimize the conflict requires a full range of institutions such as rule of law, a fairly legal system, a political voice for minority groups. This kind of institutions are required. Rule of law, a fair legal system, a political voice for minority groups. This kind of institutions are required for the economic development. It is not easy to bring about the institutional change. There is a collective action problem that limits potential gainers from bringing about change in opposition to vested interest. One is the free rider problem about sharing the cost of change. It's not very easy to bring institutional change. One problem is the free rider problem, and other is the bargaining problem relating to sharing the potential benefits to change. The main two problems related to the institutional change is the free rider problem and bargaining problem. It can be difficult to potential gain. It can difficult to potential gainers to compensate potential losses. For example, land reforms. In case of land reforms, some are gainers, but some are losers. So it is very difficult to compensate gainers to losses. In this kind of circumstances, the state has a role to play in fostering institutional change and development. Roderick also argued that institutions needed to be developed locally, relying on hands-on experience, local knowledge, and experimentations. Institutions need to be developed locally. Depends on the hands-on experience, local knowledge, and experimentation. And next, measuring institutions. It's not easy to measure institutional development and its impact on economic performance because institutional development itself is endogenous to economic development. Institutional development is endogenous to economic development. An exogenous measure of institutions is required. Several measures of institutions have been used in empirical studies. That first one is an aggregate governance index. Aggregate governance index. It is an average of 6 measures of institutions. This aggregate governance index is an average of 6 measures of institutions. That 6 measures are voice and accountability, political stability and absence of violence, government effectiveness, regulatory burden, rule of law, and freedom from graft or corruption. The average of this is this these three measures of institutions used as aggregate governance index. Other measures are a measure of property rights and risk of expropriation, an index of democracy, political rights and civil liberties, political instability, an index of corruption, economic freedom, and index of social division. These are also measures of institutions, but it's not needed to study detail. These are enough. Okay, thank you.